remember the day was sunny and perfect for a walk outdoors, so Charlie, my husband, and I decided to take our little Billy to explore the woods. I was a year old when I and Charlie moved to this quiet little mountain town in Maine. He grew up in this woodland community, and ever since we met a little over 2 years ago, he had been urging me to move there with my son Billy. Although Charlie was not his biological father, he loved him as if he were. He spent a lot of time with Billy, took care of him, and was always very attentive to him. That made me feel very grateful and lucky to have a man like him by my side, because in everyone's eyes, he was his dad in every way. That day, Billy was very excited about the idea of spending time in nature, as he loved exploring the forest and watching the wild animals. And for me, seeing his enthusiasm filled me with joy. I remember everything about that day, every detail, as if it were yesterday. The forest floor was covered with dry leaves and twigs that crunched under our feet as we walked. The air smelled of fresh pine, and it was so revitalizing that it made you feel refreshed. As we walked deeper into the forest, the tall, slender trees towered skyward, and their branches stretched upward, creating a web of green leaves that filtered the sunlight, and it shone through the leaves, creating a play of shadows on the ground that was truly magical. But who would have thought that at nightfall, this magical place would turn into a real hell? We continued to go deeper into nature, and as we went on, we could hear the birds chirping and twittering in the branches, and the buzzing of insects fluttering around. If you paid attention, you could see squirrels scurrying through the trees and small animals hiding in the bushes. It was a truly enchanting place. When we reached the heart of the forest, we found a small stream of crystal clear water flowing slowly. The banks were covered with green moss, but there was an unpleasant smell that made you want to quickly get away from there. Still, we waded in together, and Billy was fascinated by the beauty of the place. But after a while, Charlie and I got a little distracted, and in those brief moments Billy wandered off, and we lost sight of him. When we realized he was not in the vicinity, we started looking for him everywhere, shouting his name all over the place, but there was no sign of him. My little boy was only 4 years old, so he wasn't supposed to be too far away, so after about 10 minutes of searching everywhere without finding him, I couldn't believe what was happening. Fear and despair came over me like never before in my life, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the horrible things that could have happened to Billy. We searched for hours, but found no clues, and when we realized the sun was beginning to set, we decided to get help and alert the authorities. I remember my son was wearing a green t-shirt, blue jeans, and white tennis shoes, which we immediately reported to the police. The search continued for days, but there was no trace of our little boy. It was as if the forest had swallowed him completely. That day I refused to return home. Charlie and I spent the night in the woods with the search parties, but we found no trace of my son, and with each passing hour, my heart grew tighter and tighter. There are no words to describe what a mother's heart can feel at such a moment. As the days went by, my desperation grew. I couldn't stop thinking about him and what he might be suffering in that dangerous place. Every day I returned to the forest, hoping to find some clue, but it all seemed in vain. My mother's love was so strong that I could not give up. I had to find a solution, a clue, an answer, anything that would lead me to my son. Billy could not just disappear as if nothing. He had to be somewhere, and I was not going to rest until I found him. Although the hopes of finding him alive were fading with each passing day. Charlie was as desperate as I was. That's why one weekend, after a month without Billy's reason and without anyone finding even a clue, we decided to go deep into the forest. We didn't care how dangerous it was. We were willing to find our son at any cost. That time we went through a part of the forest where we had never been before, and after 2 days deep in the mountain, we found a cabin hidden in the middle of the trees. This turned out to belong to an old woman who lived alone, and I remember that as soon as I saw her, I ran to her and asked her if she had seen Billy. I was ready to offer her a reward for helping me look for him, because something inside me told me that he was still alive, lost in that mysterious place. The old woman looked at me with tired eyes and told me that she had not seen my son, but she warned me that she had heard rumors about a spirit lurking in the forest, a spirit that could take children away. I was chilled to hear that. At this point, I didn't know what to believe, but I couldn't let fear stop me. I had to keep looking for my son. So, armed with the old woman's information, I decided to return to the forest the next day. Billy was my whole world, and I would do whatever it took to bring him home. That woman had told me that the authorities had been by, and that she had heard rumors of a boy who was seen with a mysterious man in the woods. The descriptions of the boy matched Billy's characteristics perfectly, which made my heart swell with hope. After so long, I finally had some clue as to my son's whereabouts, so this renewed my faith that I could find him alive. After hearing that, I asked the woman if she knew anything else about the man, if she had seen him pass by or if he had any particular sign, but she assured me that was all she knew. With this new information, a new search of the forest was organized, and we all began to look for clues that might lead us to find my son and the mysterious man. But despite all efforts, we found nothing concrete that would indicate their whereabouts. The news that Billy and the strange man had been seen in the woods spread quickly, and many people volunteered to help in the search. Some adventurers and explorers went into the forest determined to find them, but none found anything significant. Since we were again at a dead end, I decided to go back to the old woman at the cabin and ask her to tell me about the legend she had told me about the first time we saw her. She invited me in and made a cup of tea, then began to talk about a legend that said that many years ago, a lonely and mysterious man lived in this forest. This guy had been driven out of his home village because of his strange behavior and unpleasant appearance. In his village, it was said that he was not fully human and possessed supernatural abilities, so people were at first afraid to approach him, but over time, some realized that he was not dangerous and began to visit him. However, the man always kept his distance and did not talk much. Legend has it that one night, the man disappeared from the forest without a trace. Many thought he had died or been murdered, but others believed he had simply returned home. Since then, those who venture into the forest claim to have seen the mysterious man from time to time, walking among the trees or watching them from a distance, but no one has been able to get close enough to discover his true identity and find out if he is really human or a supernatural creature. When I asked the old woman about the whereabouts of that fellow, she quickly replied that the man had disappeared without a trace, that many believed he had died or been killed, but others thought he had simply returned to his place of origin. He assured me that since then, those who venture into the forest claim to have seen him from time to time, but no one has been able to get close enough. At the time, I thought the worst. The thought that my son might have encountered someone like that terrified me and filled me with guilt for not protecting him properly. But I couldn't stop to think about what I could have done and didn't do, so I quickly decided to act and find out everything I could about the man in question. First, I started talking to the local authorities to see if they had any record of his criminal past, and after several calls, I finally managed to get some information about that guy. It turns out that years ago, that man had been arrested multiple times and had a terrifying criminal record, with a history of kidnappings, rapes, and other horrible criminal acts. My heart sank when I heard that. The possibility that Billy had fallen into the clutches of someone like that filled me with panic. Now I knew I had to do something, and fast, so with this new information, I decided to organize a larger search party. I talked to other parents in town and some family friends, and they were all willing to help. I knew I couldn't just sit idly by while the clock was ticking. I had to find my son before it was too late. With a map in hand and a flashlight, we headed into the forest at dawn. The sunlight barely penetrated through the trees, and the air was permeated with an eerie silence. Every rustle of the branches and every whisper of the wind made my hair stand on end, but I couldn't let fear stop me. I had to find my son. As we walked, I remembered the stories my grandmother told about the forest and its secrets, and there was definitely something in the air that told me we were not alone. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind some bushes and my heart stopped. Could it be Billy? I approached slowly, holding my breath, but when I peeked out, all I found was a deer looking at us curiously before disappearing into the trees. We continued searching, calling for Billy at every turn, but the forest seemed to swallow our voices. Despair was beginning to take hold of me every minute, when suddenly I saw something shiny among the leaves. My heart raced as I saw what it was. It was a button from Billy's jacket. He was close. He had to be. And now I knew he had been there. We moved on more and more convinced that we were on the right track. The search continued, and although the deep fear I felt never faded, hope began to blossom in my chest. However, there was something else that tormented me, and that was that the word was that this was a guy with many faces, someone who had managed to slip away from justice because he was so good at hiding and impersonating other people, as if he had no identity of his own. But that was only one of the many versions I heard, because the old men in town who knew him also said that he was a guy who had gone crazy after losing his only son, and that we were not really looking for a human being, but a soul in pain, since this man had taken his own life years ago. They claimed that he was an evil spirit who was still looking for his son, taking innocent children along the way. But others said that he spread the rumor of his suicide so that his file would be closed and no one would look for him. In short, the only thing certain about this man was that he was most likely the one who had my son. And that was all that mattered to me. Whether dead or alive, I was going to find him and rescue Billy. My only real fear was getting to him too late. Unfortunately, we couldn't find Billy's whereabouts that day either. And as night began to fall, everyone went home to continue the next day. All except Charlie and I, who decided to camp out in the woods to get an early start from where we were. The next morning, as soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, Charlie and I got up and started our search. A couple of hours passed and we hadn't found anything. But for some reason, that day I had a strong hunch. It was as if I had a certainty in my heart that this would be the day I would find Billy. To extend the search range a little further, Charlie and I decided to split up and meet back at camp. When it was about 9 a.m., while exploring a part of the forest I had never seen before, I found a cave. I went over to investigate and noticed some things inside, and as I looked closer, my heart shrank when I saw that they were Billy's belongings. His favorite green t-shirt, the one he was wearing the last day I saw him. I couldn't believe it. I had found something of my son's after so long. My heart pounding, I went deeper into the cave in search of more clues, and it didn't take me long to find them. Further on, I found a notebook. Carefully, I opened it and saw that it was full of drawings, and those were definitely Billy's. I recognized his strokes, and he still didn't know how to write. But it was right at that moment that I discovered the heartbreaking truth behind my son's disappearance, and in the worst way. As I held the notebook, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I recognized those footsteps immediately. They were Charlie's. I quickly turned around, excited to tell him what I had found. But as soon as I did, all I saw was Charlie wielding his knife and then plunging it into my abdomen as he looked me in the eyes with the coldest and most devilish expression I had ever seen in his eyes. Why, was all I managed to ask him before everything went black, but I got no answer, just a sickly half smile, which told me everything. The next time I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of the cave. It took me a while to come to my senses. I was dizzy and lightheaded, but soon, the memories of what happened began to crowd in one by one, and the stabbing pain I felt in my abdomen, as well as the blood gushing from there, made it clear to me that it had not been a nightmare. As best I could, I got to my feet. I didn't know what time it was. I didn't know how long it had been. The only thing I knew was that I had to get out of there and get help. Now it was clear to me that not only my life depended on it, but also Billy's, because I knew he was alive. Logic told me that was very unlikely, but my mother's heart and my instinct told me that he was still here, and now more than ever he needed me. As best I could, I stood up, squeezing the wound with my hands, and managed to get out of the cave, dragging my steps, making a titanic effort to stay conscious and endure the pain. I was losing a lot of blood, and very fast, but I still managed to get to the camp and grab my cell phone. As I made my way there, I was praying to the heavens all the time that Charlie was not around, but I had no choice. I was too far from town, and I would not make it there alive. So my only hope was to call 911 and wait for them to come for me. praying that Charlie would not come back and find me, because that would be it. Fortunately, we had chosen one of the few places in the forest where there was a phone signal to camp, this to keep in contact with the other search party, so I immediately dialed 911, and in case I didn't survive, I told them everything and told them they should look for Charlie as soon as possible. The last thing I heard was the operator telling me that a team was on its way and to stay on the line, but I collapsed right then and there, and the next time I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room with an oxygen mask on and hooked up to some equipment. For a moment I thought it had all been a nightmare, but when I tried to sit up, the pain in my abdomen reminded me again that it was all real. My mother was beside me, and she jumped when she saw me move. The first thing I did was ask for Billy, with a knot in my chest, fearing for the answer to that question, but my soul came down into my body. My mother smiled and told me that she found him, and that he was also in the hospital. At that moment, I felt a mixture of joy and fear. I could not explain it in words. I felt happy and relieved to know that they had finally found my son and that he was alive, but knowing that he was in the hospital made my chest tighten. That only meant that he was not well, and I was not wrong. It turned out that the man I married was nothing but a psychopath and a monster. Charlie, who pretended to be the perfect husband and a fantastic father to Billy, was actually a member of some kind of satanic cult, and during all this time he held my son captive to feed on his blood, which he extracted from him with a syringe and then drank it mixed with other herbs. But the creepiest thing is that the culmination of this kind of sick rite was to sacrifice Billy and deliver his body as an offering on the last full moon of the year, which would be in 3 days. Knowing this made my blood run cold, but most of all, it filled me with rage, not only at that wretch, but at myself for having brought that monster into our lives. Fortunately, both Billy and I managed to recover. This sick man had drained so much blood from my son's body that he needed several transfusions in order to survive, and the doctors estimated that he might not even have made it to the next full moon alive, had they not been able to find him in time. But luckily the police managed to find him hiding in the old woman's cabin, whom he had taken hostage. I have no words to explain how happy I was to see my son again, to hug him after those eternal 6 weeks, and kiss his forehead as I always did. After this bitter experience, I decided to move back to my hometown and start a new life with just Billy and me, while Charlie rots in jail with no chance of ever getting out. Two gray vans waited on the street as they picked up our things. My 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, and my wife, Lauren, had traveled across the United States to move to the small southern town that would be our new home from now on, as I had received a very good job offer that promised to provide a better life for all of us. The change was a big turnaround in our lives, as we had come from living in a big, bustling city. But there was laughter as we settled into the old white brick and stone house that was to be our new home. At first, it looked very nice and cozy. It had 2 rooms downstairs and 2 upstairs. The second floor had a kitchen and living room, while the bedrooms were on the second floor. On the first day, we put our things in the downstairs rooms and gradually distributed them to the upper floors. When I first went upstairs and took a look at the room on the left, which would be Sophia's, I noticed a piece of wallpaper pulled up in the corner of the wall, surrounded by a musty blue stain. The house was quite old, maybe a century old, and had a sort of stagnant feel to it, but I figured that was normal for such an old house, and well, that's what we were there for, to give it a new air, a new life, and make it a home again. As time went by, we settled our things, and Sophia's room started to look cozier, at least it did for the first 2 weeks. After I left my job at the office, things were going well, if a little exhausting, frankly, but I enjoyed coming home and seeing Sophia smiling and Lauren relaxing on the couch, reading a magazine or surfing the internet. Everything went smoothly for a while. The food was good, the dreams were pleasant, and although the house wasn't new, there was nothing to disturb our peace and quiet, day or night. It was a very peaceful place. However, Things began to change after the first fortnight. I started having disturbing dreams that left me very disturbed. I remember one night, after turning out the light and kissing Lauren goodnight, I slid into bed and closed my eyes to try to fall asleep, as I was due to wake up early the next day. But suddenly I felt a strange pressure, as if something was sinking me deeper into the mattress. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I started to hear soft voices. They were like children's whispers, murmuring and singing, appearing and disappearing in my dreams. I tried to get up, but when I did, I realized there was no door to my room. I stumbled in the dark, feeling trapped in a nightmare, and walked forward, but only saw walls to my left and right. It was as if I was in an endless tunnel. Strange inscriptions covered the walls, and the chanting of children kept echoing in a subtle, persistent tone. The feeling of being trapped intensified, and every time I tried to wake up, I found myself back in that tunnel, surrounded by whispers and shadows. Restlessness grew in me, and I wondered if something in this house was trying to communicate. I finally entered and approached a door to my right and pressed the light switch. Then the darkness around me disappeared, but in an instant, a shiver ran through my entire body. I heard sobbing, a wet cry that seemed like an endless echo. It was my daughter's cry, just on the other side of the door. My heart raced, and I immediately pulled the door handle, and what I saw would haunt me forever. Two thin, twisted arms, like those of a spider, emerged from the crumpled wallpaper on the wall, coming closer and closer, as if they wanted to catch her. While she stood there, still and distant, staring with an expression of despair that chilled my blood. And every now and then, she would let out a heartbreaking sound that made me feel as if my mind was crumbling. I stood transfixed, watching those horrible black arms twisting and clinging to her frail body. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I just watched helplessly as the arms gripped her tightly and dragged her toward the wall. With every beat of my heart, the terror grew until, when her form almost merged with that blue stain on the wall, I let out a desperate scream and lunged towards her. The next thing I knew, I woke up, not knowing how much time had passed. I stared at the chilling silence in my room, as my wife slept soundly beside me. When I finally regained my composure, the first thing I did was to go and check that Sophia was okay, so I went to her room. Breathing heavily, I opened the door and saw her. She was sound asleep and her face showed serenity. It was clear she was having a good sleep, unlike me who seemed to be freaking out with every excruciating nightmare. My lips curved into a smile, but when I slid my gaze to the crumpled wallpaper in the corner, I realized that it was no longer crumpled. It had been ripped off, and the blue stain had darkened and widened, as if those horrible spider arms were hiding there, invisible. At that moment, I felt terror take hold of me, spreading across my skin. I looked at Sophie and saw that her arms were marked with faint dark bruises as she slept. I wanted to scream to wake her up and ask her what was going on, but I could only stare in a daze. I tried to calm down and think logically. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she got those bruises playing or something. I tried to convince myself of that. Well, after all, my mental state was not the best after several days without sleep due to nightmares, so I just calmed down, closed the door, went back to my bed and tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. However, the next morning the bruises were still there, visible, but not as intense. I asked Sophia how she had gotten them, and she had no idea. She said she had not fallen or injured herself at any time, that those bruises just appeared out of nowhere and she hadn't even noticed. That day we decided to take her to the doctor and I kept my mouth shut. I didn't say anything. I didn't even mention that I had gone into her room that night. I didn't tell Lauren what I had dreamed about the origin of those marks, mainly because I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want terror and fear to seep into our new life, so I kept my creepy nightmares to myself. The days passed without incident, and something in Sophia began to change. Suddenly, a growing sense of numbness and lack of excitement came over our little girl. It was as if she was slipping into a world of her own, away from us, trapped in the same darkness that enveloped the old house at night. That darkness covered the walls and the strange scribbles that seemed to anticipate children's voices and eerie scenes. About a week later, something happened that I will never forget. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, wanting some water, so I went downstairs to the living room and then headed for the kitchen. When I got there, I thought I heard those faint whispers again. These were barely coherent, and I could almost make out the words, but not quite. I poured myself a glass of water and went back upstairs. However, when I reached the landing, I stopped and turned left, towards Sophia's room. Then the soft whispers started to be heard more clearly there. It was like an incantation, or like sobs, but very low. I slowly approached and opened the door, but what I saw was so chilling that it surpassed my worst nightmares. There, in the corner of the room, was Sophia, staring at a torn piece of wallpaper and mumbling incoherent words to the wall. But her mutterings were not the only sound in the room. There were other undefined noises creeping along the walls, disturbing the air with chills. But suddenly, a large spider-like hand emerged from the wall, quick as lightning, and headed for my daughter. At that moment, I jumped out of sheer inertia and grabbed Sophia's hand, dragging her away from the wall before the thing could catch her. At that same instant, I grabbed my daughter in my arms, slammed the door shut, and ran to my room. And once there, I woke Lauren up and told her we needed to get out of there immediately. She looked at me in surprise, but seeing Sophie in my arms and my desperate face, she didn't even ask me. She just jumped out of bed and the three of us shot out of the house. That night, we didn't go back to the house. Instead, we went to a cheap motel a few miles away. The next time we had contact with that cursed house was when we went back to get our stuff to get the hell out of there and never come back. I never knew what that thing was. I want to know. All I know is that there was no way I was going to let it take my daughter. This terrifying experience left me traumatized. Since then, I can't help but wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, just to make sure the door is locked and there are no noises in our new home. I grope my way to Sophia's room and don't go back to sleep until I'm sure she's okay, quiet, and with nothing to disturb her sleep. I just hope that whatever that evil thing is hiding in that house never finds a new victim. A couple of years ago, I moved to a quiet little town in Arizona. I had previously lived in a suburb a few miles away, but this place was a complete nightmare, as I had the worst neighbors you can have. These were a bunch of pubescent kids who partied every weekend and annoyed the whole neighborhood. And to top it off, they were always bringing undesirable people to our street. So after almost 3 years of torment, I decided to look for a quiet and secluded place to live. And this town was perfect. Besides, my neighbors were the best I could find, polite, kind, but most of all, silent people. However, nothing can be perfect, as the saying goes, and soon my idol of good neighborliness would be damaged by something even worse than a couple of partying neighbors. A toxic couple. I had been living in this town for a year when my next-door neighbor told me in a casual conversation while watering the garden that she found a boyfriend and that things were going well, and told me he would soon be moving in with her. I congratulated her on her new relationship and wished her well. But just a month later, things began to change drastically next door. Loud arguments could often be heard through the walls, and the dog reacted as badly as I did, the poor little guy barking like crazy, while my neighbor and the new love of her life yelled at each other repeatedly. I tried. I ignored the noise for a couple of weeks, but finally lost my mind and started banging on the wall. This seemed to surprise them, because for a few minutes they were silent, but only at first, because then they continued arguing, and all the other blows I hit the wall were completely ignored. The arguments continued for more than 3 months, and after several visits from the police, my neighbor showed up at my door to apologize. He claimed that things were going well, just as he had told me before, but after he moved in, his behavior changed radically. I just told her that I was sorry, but that I also had the right to have peace of mind. She apologized and said it wouldn't happen again, but it did. Just a few days later, they had another horrible argument in which he even physically assaulted her, But before the police could find out, she had already forgiven him. That night, he swore it would never happen again, and I know because I could hear absolutely all the drama through our shared wall. The thing is, after promising not to assault her again, he did, and after another huge, loud fight, she kicked him out of the house. I couldn't have been happier, for her and for me. Her hope was that he would move in with someone else. However, he soon showed up on her doorstep out of nowhere, begging her to take him back, so she called the police and got a restraining order. It was almost a month ago and I was hoping he was gone for good, and it seemed that way. From what I could see and hear, things were back to the way they were originally. I was back to living a peaceful life, and I assumed she was too. Considering we had opposite schedules, it wasn't unusual for us to go weeks without seeing or hearing from each other, and I was happy to keep it that way. But then, something scary would happen. One day, on my way home from work, I was about to go into my garage, but I was blocked by several police cars and an ambulance at the gate. It was a startling thing to see, but it was none of my business. I parked on the street and headed for my door, but as I approached, I noticed that my neighbor's was wide open, and police officers were coming in and out. After what she told me, I assumed that her ex had shown up uninvited back at her house. Another officer stopped me and informed me that the area was closed. I let him know I lived next door and asked what had happened. He said they couldn't tell me, but if I waited for a detective to come out, he would probably have some questions for me. The cop said something over the radio a minute later, and then a guy in a suit came out of the house and took me aside. He just had a few questions, asked me if I had seen anything, where I was during the day, if I knew of anyone my neighbor was having problems with, and other things. I answered everything he asked without hesitation, but as the seconds passed, I became more and more nervous and begged him to tell me what was going on. He paused and said in a very serious tone that my neighbor had been found dead in her apartment earlier that day. My eyes must have looked like saucers. I was completely shocked and wondered how I had missed something so important. But before the policeman could ask the question, I blurted out the answer without thinking. It was her ex. The cop's reaction to my answer made me realize that he was their prime suspect. The detective finally handed me his card and let me go. The next morning, I was browsing the local newspaper online and found a story about the murder. It explained that my neighbor was a week late in paying rent and received a notice. When no response came after 2 days, the manager visited the apartment personally. There was no response even after he called her, so he went inside and found the house, which is how he found the body. The detective was quoted as saying that they still had not found her ex, and that they believed she had fled back to her original home in Lebanon. Not much information has come out since then. The ex-boyfriend is still unaccounted for, and there are no other suspects at this time. In 2015, I was 22 years old and had just graduated from electrical lineman school. However, it was not so easy to get a job in my field, since most of the well-paying jobs required to have at least 1 year of professional experience, something that a recent graduate does not have, which is very paradoxical, because how to get experience if they don't give you a job without experience? Anyway, the fact is that I was going through a somewhat complicated economic situation, and the truth is that I needed a job soon, and the closest thing I found to my specialty was a position as a utility locator. For those of you not familiar with the term, almost everyone I guess, my job was basically to find subway power, gas and phone lines for homeowners or contractors, and to do that I had to use a sophisticated metal detector, which was quite powerful. I remember always fantasizing about finding buried treasure, but unfortunately this never happened. Instead, all I found was the scariest experience of my life. I must say that this job took me to some pretty strange and mysterious places sometimes, like abandoned houses destined to be demolished, old industries that went bankrupt and the like, but most of the time it was quite interesting, more than I expected. On this day, November 22nd, 2015, I was contacted to find the power and phone lines to an old house that was soon to be demolished. The owner wanted to meet with me to give me a general idea of where the location should start, so I called him on the day of the inspection, and he informed me that the house had been uninhabited since 1982. The man told me that he had purchased this property about 15 years ago, but had never set foot on it. This seemed a bit strange to me. I remember thinking, who would buy a property and never use it? But of course I didn't ask him. Instead, we agreed to meet in 10 minutes at the property. I quickly packed my things and headed to the site to wait for the owner to arrive, but after 30 minutes, he still didn't show up. I didn't have too much time to waste, so I decided to go down a road I saw nearby and walk around to see if I could get the entrance. The house was located in an old farmhouse and the extension was about 1 kilometer. It was also surrounded by a fairly dense forest that barely let you see through it, the back of the house, which was really very large. Finally, I managed to get inside, and as I approached the house, I could see that there was a lot of old and rusty farm equipment in the vicinity, as well as several vehicles in the same condition. This was a bit strange. It was as if the previous owner, or the people who lived there, had abandoned the property from one day to the next because they did not fix or take anything away. There were even 2 cars parked in a careless way. Being in that place made me feel a strange sensation, since there was practically nothing for miles around, and the feeling of isolation was quite overwhelming, especially because that place seemed to be suspended in time. It is something difficult to explain, but it was strange. After a brief reconnaissance, I decided to start work, since after 40 minutes the owner had not yet arrived. When I had been inspecting the area for about an hour and a half, I decided that I had waited long enough and I was ready to leave the place. I also had a disturbing feeling of isolation that for some reason was unbearable at that point. But just as I was about to leave the property and continue another day, I noticed that there was a door on the side of the house, which was hidden among the bushes that were basically swallowing the house. At that moment, my curiosity won out over my sixth sense, the one that was screaming for me to leave that farm immediately. I made my way through the brush and pushed the bushes away from the door, and noticed that the door had a huge hole in the lower right corner, through which I could crawl in. However, as I took a look around, I noticed that there were animal droppings all over the ground, so I grabbed some branches and pushed them as far away as I could. That wasn't too hard because they were dry. Then, doing my best to avoid them, I slipped through the hole, stood up and began to explore the place. Terrible mistake. The first thing I noticed was that while the house was practically in a state of decay, nothing inside had been touched except for some broken dishes on the kitchen floor, but all the silverware was in the drawers. There were dishes in the sink, a pot on the stove with something fossilized inside, and the dish towel was still in the mezzanine, although it was black with mold and rot. I opened the fridge and saw a disgusting substance stuck to the bottom, but other than that it was empty. I left the kitchen and entered the living room. The carpet was soaked and full of something that would give someone obsessed with cleanliness nightmares. As I looked up, my eyes fell on something on the coffee table. It was an old photo of a man wearing an old hat and a brown leather jacket, and he was holding 2 children who seemed to be happy and having a great time. The man's face also reflected happiness, although his smile looked forced and tired, but I assumed it was the face of a man who worked hard for his children. We all know that working on a farm is not an easy thing to do. I pushed the photo aside and looked up at the roof above me, which had caved in due to water damage over so many years. I wanted to explore the floor above, but I didn't want to risk the ground giving way under my feet, so I preferred to just go back outside and finish the job. As I left the house, I was hopeful that the homeowner had arrived, but there was no sign of the guy. I was already getting angry about this. It seemed too irresponsible of him to make a commitment and then not show up. I didn't want to give it any more thought and decided to finish the job. After all, I was already there, so I located the hydrometer and the phone line, then hooked it up to the hydrometer and turned on my machine. It was right about this time when things got really scary. My locating wand was over a power line that was beeping, but it wasn't a regular one. It was screeching, and no matter which way I moved the wand, it kept screeching. But as I kept moving the wand, I saw something near one of the old farm equipment that caught my attention. At first, I couldn't make it out well, because it was quite far away, but then I looked closely and could make out a man crouched down looking at a rusty old tractor. I approached, thinking it was the owner, the man I had been waiting for 2 hours. I called out to him to let him know I was there, But there was no answer, so I kept walking, and when I was about 25 meters away from him, my wand, which was screeching like crazy, made a popping sound and went out. This rather surprised me, as I had fresh batteries and it shouldn't have gone out, so I rubbed my head and continued towards the man, still trying to talk to him and assuming he was half deaf. When I was about 10 meters from where he was, I stopped dead in my tracks, as I noticed something rather disturbing about him. This man was wearing a brown leather jacket and the same old hat I saw in the photo on the coffee table inside the house. This threw me off a bit, but I yelled at him again, as he hadn't responded to me so far, and my attempts to communicate were in vain. But suddenly something really strange and creepy happened. The light outside instantly darkened and dark clouds seemed to appear out of nowhere. My ears were completely covered due to the sudden atmospheric change, and I grabbed my head in pain as a piercing sensation arose behind my eyes. It was too intense, but once I recovered, I opened my eyes and looked straight ahead. At that moment my body froze, and I'm sure the color left my face completely. That man was now standing only 2 meters away from me, with his head slightly tilted, which made the brim of his hat cover his face, and with his arms rigidly glued to his sides, as if he was in tension. Meanwhile, my eyes were going through his body without giving credit to what I was seeing at that moment. But what but the most frightening was about to happen. Suddenly, the man raised his head and turned it towards me, and when I thought I could not feel more panic, I looked at his face, and then my legs weakened, and for an instant I felt that I would faint. That man had no face. Literally. He had no nose, no eyes, no mouth. He was a kind of very black shadow. But somehow, I knew he was looking at me. I took a step back, scared to death, and suddenly I felt my vision dim, and I was about to lose consciousness. But then that man, or rather that specter, went crazy and began to scream. It was a high-pitched, twisted shriek. It was something inhuman, but it sounded as if it was completely muffled, as if it were shrieking into a pillow. I immediately came to my senses, so to speak, and as I emitted that blood-curdling shriek, the thing dropped to its knees and started clawing at the face it didn't have, as if it was very desperate. It was totally surreal and very, very scary. I was so terrified that I couldn't move. My body just trembled, while my mind froze in that instant. After that, he suddenly went silent, then sat up and suddenly looked calm and cold. That's when he turned completely towards me, extended an arm in my direction, and started beckoning me with his fingers to come towards him. At that instant, I felt such a rush of adrenaline that I immediately snapped out of my paralyzed state, and my legs began to move on their own. I turned around and started running like I had never run before. But then the terrifying scream came again, only this time the sound was accompanied by footsteps following close behind me, so I left all my tools there and ran at full speed towards my car, and I don't even know how I did it, but in a split second I started the engine and pushed the gas pedal to the metal, getting out of there in a jiffy. When I was finally on the other side of the gate, and still with my adrenaline pumping, I looked in the rearview mirror and felt my heart skip a beat. When I saw that thing standing in the driveway, waving goodbye very slowly with its hand, as if mocking me. I was scared to the bone at that point. I called my boss and told him I would end my day early, but I didn't tell him anything about what had happened in that hellish place. I got home very quickly and went to bed trying to forget the events of that day, but obviously could not. I was nervous and insomniac for weeks. I couldn't stop thinking about it and turning it over in my head. It was something so surreal that I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, but I knew my imagination was not macabre. A few months later, on Christmas Day, when I was finally putting all this behind me and concentrating on the holidays, I arrived at my parents' house to celebrate the holiday and open presents. That day I was especially excited, since I had bought them both what they most wanted, and after opening all the gifts and sharing a delicious dinner, at about 10 p.m. my mom received a call and passed me the phone. I looked at her with a strange gesture, because I did not know who could be calling me that day, and at that hour, since I did not even have a boyfriend. I put my ear to the receiver, and when I did so, my eyes opened wide, my mouth opened, and my breathing stopped. I looked at my parents, and they had the same expression. What I was hearing on the other side was that same painful scream, terribly sharp and contained, that tormented me so much in recent months. But the most chilling thing is that my parents could also hear it from where they were sitting. In an instant, my dad's face changed from horror to anger, while my mom was confused and terrified. At that point, I hung up the phone and finally told my parents about what had happened that day in that old abandoned farmhouse. They were horrified by what they heard, but tried to comfort me. However, I felt that I had lived through too much torment over the past few months to let that thing ruin my favorite day of the year. So I pulled myself together as best I could, and after a few glasses of wine with my family and friends, I put the incident aside, as did my parents, and we ended the evening happily, as it was meant to be. However, that was not the last time I received that call with just that eerie sound. This was repeated several times for almost a year, until it finally stopped, and to this day, I have not heard it again. A few months later, I returned to that demonic farm to retrieve my tools, but this time in the company of 2 more companions, to whom I obviously told nothing, as they would not have accompanied me so willingly. However, that time nothing strange happened, but he warned them not to enter the house. I am sure that that spirit, or whatever that thing was the man in the photo, but I never knew anything about his story or what happened on that property for something so sinister to take place there.